Greetings, everyone. I'm Anshika Srivastav, pursuing BTech CSE in DevOps specialization from UPS. Today, we'll be embarking on the journey to an introduction to the history of India, which spans across thousands of millennia. Few civilizations on Earth have lived this long, transformed this much, and yet preserved so much of their original character. India's history isn't just a timeline, it's a conversation across millennia. As we trace the journey, I want you to look beyond dates and dynasties and instead see a long living civilization and see it shaping itself, constantly responding to the new worlds. Let's begin. So, before we move into the timelines, this slide highlights the two themes that act as India's historical DNA. The first is continuity, the astonishing ability of ideas like dharma, social customs, festivals, languages, and even philosophical debates to survive for thousands of years. Indian society rarely discards old ideas. It absorbs them, reshapes them, and carries them forward. The second is diversity, not just cultural diversity, but geographical, linguistic, religious, and ethnic variation. India is a subcontinent precisely because it contains many Indias within it. These two threads, continuity and diversity, are the key to understanding everything that follows. Now, let's talk about the ancient beginnings, roughly from 3300 BCE to 500 CE. This era includes the world's earliest cities, the birth of major religions, the rise of early kingdoms, and breakthroughs in science and philosophy. Nearly every foundation of classical Indian civilization originates from here. So, now talking about the Indus Valley civilization, one of humanity's oldest urban cultures. When we think of early civilizations, we often imagine Mesopotamia or Egypt, but the Indus cities were just as advanced. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro featured stunning city planning, perfectly aligned streets, indoor plumbing, brick houses, and even public granaries. What's intriguing is what we don't know. Their script remains undeciphered, and their decline around 1300 BC is still a mystery. This civilization shows us that organized urban life began in India far earlier than most people often realize. Moving on with the Vedic Age. This is named after the Vedas, the earliest sacred texts of Indian civilization. This period begins with pastoral, semi nomadic tribes gradually shifting to settled agriculture, giving rise early states known as the Janpads. It is in this period that social structures like one began to emerge and ideas like sacrifice, cosmic order, and spirituality developed. The philosophical debates that later inspired Hindu thought have all their roots right here. Now, moving to the ideas of Buddhism and Jainism. By the 5th century BCE, we see a remarkable intellectual revolution. This slide shows Buddhism and Jainism, both arising as critiques of ritualism and social hierarchy. Buddha proposed the middle way and a deeply practical path to end suffering. Mahavir, on the other hand, emphasized absolute non-violence and self-discipline. These ideas did not remain confined to India. They eventually spread across Asia, influencing entire civilizations. This moment proves how India's spiritual landscape evolved through questioning and reform. Now, moving on to the modern empire, we enter into India's first great empire. Chandragupta Maurya built a vast, centralized state, but it was Ashoka who defines this era. After the devastating Kalinga War, Ashok transformed from a conqueror to a moral ruler. This slide references his edicts. These inscriptions are some of the earliest clear voices from Indian history, telling us about compassion, governance, and responsibility. This was one of the first attempts in world history to run an empire on ethical principles. Now, talking about the Gupta period, the classical golden age. In this era, knowledge and creativity flourished. Mathematicians formalized zero, place value, and early algebra. Astronomers like Aryabhat calculated the Earth's rotation. Artists and writers, from the sculptors of Ajanta to poets like Kalidas, produced masterpieces. This was a time when India became a global center of innovation, art, and learning. Now, as we transition into the medieval era, starting around 500 CE and continuing up to about 1500 CE, India enters a period of remarkable dynamism. This era is often misunderstood as a time of political fragmentation, but fragmentation does not mean decline. In fact, it led to an incredible cultural creativity, experimentation, and new identities. Rich kingdoms arose with their own languages, literature, art forms, and temple styles. Trade with Southeast Asia, West Asia, and even East Africa intensified. We see the rise of Bhakti and Sufi movements, which transformed religion from a formal structure into a deeply personal experience. We see new architectural styles towering southern temples, Persian arches, domes, and Indo Islamic ornamentation. So while politics changed hands frequently, Indian society and culture were flourished like never before. Now, let's move on and talk about southern empires, Cholas and Vijayanagar. On this slide, we focus on the extraordinary southern empires, which were the most stable and prosperous powers of the world. Let's begin with the Cholas, who were not just any rulers. They were administrators, artists, urban planners, and maritime strategists. Their naval expeditions reached Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Indonesia, and even touched China. This was one of the few pre modern Indian powers with a true blue water navy. Their bronze Nataraj, Shiv as the cosmic dancer, is considered one of the greatest artistic expressions in the world history. Their temples like Brihadiswarar at Tanjavanur were experiments in scale, geometry, and precision. Then came the Vijayanagara Empire, which emerged as a cultural guardian at a time when North India experienced repeated invasions. Their capital, Hampi, was described by Portuguese travelers as larger than Rome, richer than Lisbon. They perfected temple architecture, introduced advanced irrigation systems, and patronized music, especially the evolution of Carnatic tradition. These southern empires remind us that cultural and intellectual power in India was never confined to one region. It was spread across the subcontinent. Moving on with the Delhi Sultanate. As we shift our focus north, the Delhi Sultanate marks the introduction of Islamic rule, but more importantly, it marks the beginning of a new cultural fusion. This was not simply a political takeover, it was a profound interaction between Persian, Central Asian, and Indian traditions. The Sultanate brought new administrative systems, new coinage, new agricultural techniques like the Persian wheel and the new artistic vocabularies. Architecturally, the Qutub complex, Alai Darwaza, and early mosques reinterpret Indian artistry with Islamic motifs. Culturally, the rise of Sufi saints like Nizamuddin Aulia created a shared spiritual space where Indians of all backgrounds participated. One often overlooked aspect is the Sultanate's military significance. It acted as a bulwark against Mongol invasions. At a time when the Mongols were flattening kingdoms from Hungary to Baghdad, North India successfully resisted them multiple times, a huge historical achievement. The Sultanate set the stage for the next great empire that would redefine much of the subcontinent. Now, moving on to the Mughal Empire, one of the most influential empires, not just in India, but in world history. Under the Mughals, India became one of the world's largest economies, contributing nearly a quarter of global GDP, a staggering figure. Akbar introduced a centralized system of revenue collection, bureaucracy, and law that influenced Indian governance for centuries. The Mughals were also great patrons of art. Their miniatures blended Persian elegance with Indian color and detailing. Their architecture, from Humayun's tomb to the Taj Mahal, combined symmetry, geometry, calligraphy, and pure engineering brilliance. But beyond the aesthetics, the Mughal period shaped the identity of urban Indian cities like Agra, Lahore, Delhi, and Fatehpur Sikri. All these became cultural capitals, drawing in poets, architects, and musicians from all across India. By the 17th century, European travelers described Mughal India as a land of immense wealth, bustling markets, and vibrant culture, a center of global trade and luxury goods. This era closes the medieval period and opens doors to enormous change once European powers enter the Indian Ocean world. From this side onward, we enter perhaps the most destructive chapter in the Indian history, the colonial period. For nearly 350 years, India undergoes massive political, economic, and social transformation. This era is not simply about foreign rule, it reshapes India's economy, society, and identity in ways still visible today. Trade patterns shift, industries collapse, new education systems arise, and modern political consciousness begins to form. Understanding this phase is essential because many institutions and problems of modern India trace their roots to this period. Talking about the East India Company. This slide introduces the East India Company, which began as a trading organization but slowly became a military and administrative power. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 is the big pivot, using diplomacy, bribery, betrayal, and superior military strategy. The company captured Bengal's enormous wealth. With control over Bengal's revenue, the company funded more armies, more conquests, and more political manipulation. Indian princely states became dependent, indebted, or annexed. This was colonialism conducted by a corporation motivated purely by profit. Then, over hundred of years, the East India Company expanded control over most of India through alliances, war treaties, etc. Now, moving on to the Great Revolt of 1857. The Great Revolt of 1857, or the Sepoy Mutiny, begins as a mutiny of soldiers but quickly evolves into a massive uprising involving peasants, nobles, and urban groups. The rebels used symbols of the old Mughal Empire, declaring Bahadur Shah Zafar as their leader, showing a longing for a return to Indian sovereignty. Though the revolt lacked unified leadership and consistent coordination, it terrified the British, who realized that Indians across regions and backgrounds could unite against them. Its suppression was brutal. Cities destroyed, entire populations punished, and thousands executed. But its impact was irreversible. The British Crown dissolved the East India Company and took direct control, fundamentally altering India's political future. Now, moving on, the British Raj, which lasted from 1858 to 1947. Under the Raj, Britain built railways, telegraphs, universities, and a legal system. But these were designed to strengthen control, not to uplift people. Indian handloom industries collapsed under British imports. Taxes were crushing, and land revenue policies dispossessed millions of farmers. Intellectuals like Dadabhai Nauroji exposed this in his Train of Wealth theory that Britain took far more from India than it ever invested in it. The Raj also introduced modern education, which ironically gave rise to an educated middle class that could lead the freedom movement. This period is defined by both exploitation and awakening, suffering and resistance. Moving on and talking about the rise of nationalism, the freedom struggle. This was the turning point as it marks the birth of political nationalism. Educated Indians began to articulate demands for representation, rights, and accountability. Railways and printing presses connect people across regions, allowing ideas to travel faster. Social reform movements, from Raja Ram Mohan Roy to Swami Vivekanand, all challenge regressive customs while also reviving cultural pride. For the first time, Indians begin to see themselves as part of a single political community, united by common challenges. Diving deep into it, we have the Indian National Congress. The Congress formed in 1885 and it becomes the platform for national demands. Then, the moderates believed in dialogue, petitions, and gradual reform, analyzed how British rule exploited India and demanded more Indian representation. But the extremists like Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, and Bipin Chandrapal argued that self rule was not a privilege but a birthright. Their assertiveness electrified the youth and inspired future revolutionaries. This ideological tension prepared Congress for mass politics, which would soon erupt under Gandhi. Now, talking about the Gandhian era, the Gandhi and mass movement, when Gandhi returns in 1915, Indian politics transforms. He turns nationalism into a mass, moral, and non violent struggle. Under him, freedom becomes everyone's movement, be it workers, women, peasants, or students. The Salt March, the non cooperation movement, civil disobedience, and Quit India movement all mobilized millions of Indians. The world watched India's freedom struggle with admiration, an entire nation refusing to cooperate with an empire. Gandhi's strength was not just strategy, but moral power. He made freedom a question of justice, not just politics, in his Gandhian era. Moving on to the partition and independence. This takes us to 1947, the end of colonial rule, but the beginning of heartache. Decades of political negotiation had failed to resolve communal tensions. The Muslim League's demand for Pakistan and the breakdown between the Congress and the League led to the partition. What followed was one of the biggest human tragedies. Millions displaced, trains full of refugees attacked, entire towns scarred by violence. Independence was a triumph, but it definitely came at such a devastating cost. Still, the new nation emerged, determined to build, reconcile, and imagine a new future together. Now, talking about the modern era post independence. With independence, India starts a completely new chapter, building a nation out of the ruins of colonialism and the trauma of partition. The spirit is defined by institution building, economic planning, democratic consolidation, linguistic reorganization of states, and foreign policy balancing in a bipolar world. No blueprint. Had to invent one. So, talking about the architect of modern India, Jawaharlal Nehru. In this slide, we see Nehru, India's first prime minister, whose role in nation building was monumental. His vision was rooted in secularism, scientific temper, and democratic ideals. Alongside Sardar Patel, he ensured the integration of over 500 princely states, a task that could have fractured the country if mishandled. India adopted its constitution in 1950, guaranteeing rights, equality, and universal adult franchise at a time when many nations doubted whether such a diverse country could sustain democracy. Nehru invested in heavy industries, scientific research, IITs, and public sector enterprises. He believed that political democracy must be backed by economic development and modern education. The foundations laid in this period enabled India to survive wars, crises, and political change in the decades that followed. Now, as we conclude, the final slide reminds us that India's history is a story of resilience and continuity. Empires came and went, religions rose and evolved, societies changed again and again. Yet, throughout these 5,000 years, India retained a civilizational identity, layered, complex, and deeply rooted. As Mark Twain beautifully put it, India is not just old, it is timeless. It is the birthplace of philosophies, sciences, languages, and legends that still shape the world today. Thank you for joining me in this journey on exploring the history of India. Thank you.